Welcome back to the Lean Change Management podcast. This week, I'm talking with Richard Atherton, who is one of the Lean Change Agent facilitators based in London in the UK. Welcome, Richard.
Welcome. Hello. Thank you for having me.
Great. You want to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I'm Richard Atherton. I'm a management coach, and I have been involved in the Lean Agile communities. Wow, since 2000, since just after Extreme Programming was first written, before Scrum the book on Scrum was even written. So I've been around Agile for a long time. First of all, with software teams, and more latterly, taking Agile out of the software engine area and into other teams. More conversations with leadership teams around some of the principles. Yeah, that's where I'm at the moment.
Great. So we met in Hamburg in 2014. So you were one of the first guinea pigs for the very, very early workshop. And I don't know if you remember the image when we did the blast radius exercise. I still use that image in some of the courses, and I show people. And I say, well, if you look at this image, it kind of looks like a big mess of spaghetti, but it meant something at the time. And I bet you if I showed that to Richard again, he would immediately be able to remember the dynamics in that image. So
that is absolutely right. And I got a lot of insight out of that mess, out of that spaghetti. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It was the web of my client knot at the time. Yeah.
So how did you originally get introduced to these ideas? How did you hear about Lean Change, and what attracted you to it?
That's a great question. I was embarking on running a change program for a client, right? I was the program manager, and they wanted to run it agile. And I'm like, okay, well, how does one go about that, right? I was looking for I got all of the principles, but I'm like, how do you apply all this to a change program? That's something that's new, certainly to apply it in its entirety to a change program. And started Googling Agile Change, and came across Lean Change Management, and I came across your book, and I was like, this is it. Yeah, this is the book that needed to have been written. Kind of inhaled that book. I must have read it in like an evening. I just blasted through it, loved it. Immediately was like, when's the next course? Found out you're in Hamburg. I was like, right, I'm going to Germany. That's it. It was just perfect timing. I was just kicking off with this program, looking for some form of guidance. I was really excited that the client wanted to run it in an agile way, and so it was just absolutely the right time. Yeah, great book.
So I know you've done some of your own workshops and speaking, and you've tried some of these ideas out in the wild. What are some of the wins that you've had personally or with your clients?
I think if I was to sum it up, it's effectiveness, right? And we can talk about specific wins, and maybe I can get into some of the detail. But yeah, in a nutshell, it's effectiveness. When, in the same way that software teams, I say back in the late 90s and early 2000s, started to find that using some of these principles was just a better way to build software and a better way to work as a team. It absolutely proves to be the same when applied consistently and coming from the right place. As far as I can see, in pretty much all complex work and all knowledge work, and change management or change leadership is absolutely in that camp. So It just works better than traditional forms of organizing humans around complex stuff.
Yeah. I find there's always an interesting approach from either people coming from an agile background or from a change background. Is agile folks tend to just see it and inherently work that way anyway, and they're just missing the overall wrapper. So they get the values, they get the principles, the iterative nature, they know how to apply this stuff outside of software. It's almost like trying to convince other people in the organization who might be new to agile that there's kind of a different way. So when I see change people that I talk to at either conferences or that come to workshops, is they want to intentionally figure out what is the agile process that we apply to change. So it's interesting coming from the two different sides, because it's such a diverse audience. Do you see any challenges to either selling this idea or selling a different way to approach change, and where do you see people kind of getting stuck?
Okay, so there's probably two aspects to that question. So there's the selling, and then there's where do people get stuck. I think the selling is is the baggage that the agile term can come with, right? I mean, people have had experiences of failed software projects, and often people might blame the fact that people have been agile and that's been the problem. So it can come with baggage, or sometimes people can feel like, oh, it's the developers running the show and people and stuff not being in control. And so where people have had bad experiences with agile, and if this approach gets tagged with that can be a problem from a selling perspective. The lean word is less loaded. I think people, in my experience, generally have less negative connotations with the word lean. But then again, it can be seen as something that applies to manufacturing, and that's good for making cars. But what about transforming a modern or a media organization in the case of where I've been working? So sometimes the language can be problematic, and so I think from my perspective, it's actually about attempting to lead less on not trying to use it as a sales tool, actually.
Yeah.
And really come back to basics. What's the problem they're trying to solve? What are the outcomes they're looking for? As much as possible, articulating the approach in their own language, and everything back to the problem that's the client's seeking to solve. And almost the lead and the agile stuff might go in an appendix. So
Yeah, it's been around for so long now that I guess you could call them the late majority that are latching onto these agile ideas. There's so much information out there about how it's not the developers running the show, and it's not a random set of things that people just sort of run off and do whatever they want, that it's a disciplined set of practices. But we're still running up against those myths, because the patterns seem to be the same. Well, we don't document stuff, we don't plan, we don't do any of these types of things. So sometimes the agile word might get you in a little bit of trouble. So as far as sticking points, where do you see people getting stuck with some of these ideas?
So the first up is this concept of even a lightweight plan can be problematic. So even if you say, well, the way that we're going to work is iterative, and this is feedback driven, and we're going to take a bite-sized chunk at a time, and we're going to plan, we organized our change effort into sprints for certain parts of what we were doing. We would run it as a 2-week sprint, and that, for certain stakeholders in certain contexts, saying to them, we don't have a detailed plan over the next 6 to 9 months or whatever it is they need it for. We can't tell you exactly how much this is going to cost. We've not planned out all the resources for the next 1 to 2 years. Those are real sticking points, and it's a real problem for people, because they have boxes on forms that they need to write that stuff in, and if you don't give it to them, you've given them a problem,
right?
So that's a real challenge, and accepting that, I think, is really the thing that I've learned is just accepting that people are in that paradigm, and there's nothing wrong, there's nothing to fix. It's all about yes and. So yes, we'll give you that plan. Yes, we'll give you that resource estimate to the best of our ability, and we're seeking to operate in this paradigm. So it's always accept first, yes, and we're going to seek to experiment along the way, rather than attempting to hit the resistance head on. I think every time I got stuck was when I picked a battle. And every time I accepted and sought to experiment as we go, it went more smoothly. So
yeah. Now, I imagine with the idea of running things in sprints. In software, you're delivering something that is tangible, that you can see and you can touch and you can use every 2 weeks. But when you're using sprints for change, what do you show at the end of the 2 weeks? So were you doing some of the regular Scrum style ceremonies that every 2 weeks there was a quote unquote demo?
Exactly that, Jason. So we would have a show and tell.
Yeah.
So we would have what we called an internal show and tell, which was just to the change team. And sometimes we'd invited guests, right, where there were particular stakeholders with an interest.
Mhm.
And we would show them artifacts. Maybe it was an iteration of an organization design. You know, and sometimes there would be software elements to it. So maybe it was a screen we were building out a portal. Maybe it would be a screen for something. Maybe it would be a new job spec that had been written. So anything that went in the pot, really, from a change perspective, would all go into these internal show and tells. And then once a month, we would run a company-wide show and tell. So that was for the whole organization. Anyone could show up. And I used one of the tips from the Hamburg course in terms of making your work public. And we picked a thoroughfare. We picked an area where people had to pass through to get to lunch. So we really did put it out there and force people really to take notice of what we're up to. And initially, that working out loud style had its risks. We put some public boards out. We put a public Kanban showing the big epics or the big chunks of work that we were tackling through the change program, what was in the backlog, what was in progress, and what had been done out in a big public space. And it was graffitied. Dance levied at the consultants on this public board, but it did get the conversation going, and it was cathartic, and it drew some fire. But it was a great communication tool because it allowed us to understand what the resentments were that were out there, and I think it was a culture hack. It got people used to the idea that we were going to be sharing our stuff. And what started as a single board became a monthly event where we would show and tell. So this change program had 4 different work streams, and each work stream would show their wares. Each month we'd get feedback and iterate and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes that is scary for people. I'm glad you answered that, because the first question that popped into my head was, how did people react to it? Because often it's so different. We say we want transparency in our organizations, but when we actually get it kind of scares people a little bit, and there's a little bit of reluctance to put some of that information up on the wall.
That's right. And with the change program, there were limits. So with the software, we could be completely transparent with whatever it was we were building. But with the certain aspects of certainly organizational design, we stuck to principles and high-level ideas. And obviously, there was only so far the organization was prepared to go in terms of the detail.
Yeah, some are definitely more safe than others. A couple of non-software projects using the ideas around visualizing work, which is a cornerstone. No matter what agile method you use, visualization is front and center as being one of the most important things. And we visualized messaging programs to different cohorts. So rolling out a new IT system that had a pretty big business operations change that came along with it. We just visualized their messaging program. So how were they contacting the managers, directors, and all the different groups of people? We just called them cohorts, the same way you would in doing any product development. Visualized the messaging work. Visualized. They had a big wall. They called it people readiness wall.
Okay.
So it wasn't a reorganization. It wasn't anything that was too high risk to show there. But even the fact of putting stuff up on the wall, I find really helps people make sense of it. So if you can't see the work, you can't manage it. And then once you can see change work on the wall, like you said, it is a communications tool. So it starts to show people that something is happening. They might not get it yet, but they might look at this wall and go, oh, it's just some graffiti. I don't need to really care about that. But it planted the seed. And I think they may be more receptive to the conversations afterwards.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. I think it's a warming up for the conversation. I think some of these public information radiators is the gut jargon, isn't it? But it opens up a conversation. It provides the opportunity for deeper dialogue. It was a really important part of the approach, and I got that straight from the Lean Change, from the Lean Change seminar. This idea of working out loud, visualizing your work. I mean, it's interesting. It's stuff that I'd known from my time in software, but it's almost like it's given the course and the book gives you permission to use the same principles outside. It's like, oh, it's okay to do it.
Yeah.
It's it had that effect on me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Once people see a diagram or a book or something and it's officially a thing, then yeah, it makes it okay. But there's a lot of the agile coaches that I've worked with and talked to. It's the same thing for them. They intrinsically just sort of work this way. They're missing, I guess, enterprise or business safe language, if you will, to be able to use it. So instead of just saying, "Hey, we're going to take an agile approach to change," and everybody goes, "Oh, okay, cool, whatever that means." You can point to the loopy diagram and you can point to here's how
Yeah,
we can make
exactly.
the process work for us. Here's how we can take some elements from Kanban, and here's how we can take some elements from Lean Startup. And it allows you to have a conversation with stakeholders for what matters, which is cool.
That's exactly right. I think that's the real value in it. It's that
Hmm.
gives you something to hang your ideas on, and gives you some credibility. You know, there's a guy in Canada who's written this book. It's a
Yeah,
real thing. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
got a course.
Yeah. And you get that sort of exotic foreigner kind of perspective too, because here in North America, as you bring anyone from outside of North America, and people, the ears perk up, they immediately listen. They're like, "Wow, it's so exotic! You brought somebody from the UK, or you brought somebody from, when we bring Jurgen over, or anybody from Europe, people immediately listen because there's just, wow, they came all the way here to talk to us. Cool."
Yeah,
So, yeah, that's always fun too.
yeah.
How do you see some of these approaches fitting into other approaches for change? So people that might be using a more traditional framework or something that's more project management based. What are some things they can pluck and maybe use and apply to how they do stuff today?
So I think taking the visualize the work. So I mean, let's say you're McKinsey's 5S's, or one of any of those frameworks, but take any tool you're using to analyze your stakeholder group or the change that you're attempting to implement, and socialize it publicly. I mean, I think that's one thing you can take. Even if you're building a big Gantt chart, let's say
Mhm.
you're building a big ass 1,000-line Gantt chart that's going to detail out every last step of your change program. Even something like that, you could say, okay, we're going to run it in this way, and it's very linear waterfall plan, and we'll stick that. We'll do a show and tell of the plan once a month, and we'll be here at this time. It's a lean coffee, and we'll take your questions on the plan, and we'll run through them lean coffee style, one topic at a time, and we'll socialize what we're doing that way.
Mhm.
Or perhaps you've got an organizational chart and a bunch of job specs, and it's all been detailed out. Again, turn them into posters. Find an area to display them.
Mhm.
Take the metrics. Maybe you've got percentage completes against a Gantt chart, and you want to communicate that, or take the metrics out of your plan and socialize those in some way. So I certainly think that there are principles that you can take one could take from lean change and apply them to any other paradigm that you're working with. Or
Mhm. I had someone come through a course once that said, putting lean in front of change management is just a bunch of marketing nonsense. And I went, well, it kind of is, because when you hear that word lean, your brain starts to think about reducing waste and thinning things out and MVPs and doing the minimal amount of planning as possible. So I think it creates a trigger for some people that if they're being asked for the plan, they'll sit in their cube or their office for weeks or sometimes even months coming up with the perfect plan, when they can think about, well, what's the simplest thing I could do to move it forward. And
mm,
lean coffee is always been a favorite technique of mine, because we talk a lot about how are we going to communicate the change and where's our comms plan, but in the traditional sense, it's always push based. It's always a one-way message. So we use a bit of the lean thinking to shift towards dialogue versus communication,
mm,
and that's things like I worked in one large organization where they called them coffee corners, and they would have the executives come in and talk to 20 to 25 people doesn't matter where they are in the hierarchy. It was just open forums, but it was open forums. That was the point. The questions weren't seeded by the change people, um, which I see happens because we want safety. So we need to curate the questions and make sure the stakeholders are prepared and make sure that they never say, I don't know, because we can't do that, right? They have to always know. And these guys really used some of the ideas to take a totally different stance, which is, yeah, we know that we don't know, so we're not going to say that we do. And they use the lean coffee replaced some of the other push based type of communication.
Right.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
And I think I've heard you spoke about that before, and you mentioned how it was important to have the senior leaders in the coffee, but as very much as a participant, right? Not as not fronting that. Is that right? There was a nuance there to how you set it up.
Yes, it has to be, the status has to be reduced somehow. And by status, I'm taking the idea from David Rock's SCARF model, where status could be a difference in title. So if you're a junior developer and you're in a coffee corner with the CEO, you might not want to speak up. So this particular CEO would pull questions out of people. Yeah, the sense to say, it feels like something's being held back here. I want the real story. Like, how can I make this? How can I squash that status differential and make it safe for people to actually speak up? And that's really that's the open, honest dialogue that Cotter talks about with his step number 1, which is urgency. I think we end up taking those 8 steps as 8 steps. So we've created the urgency, and now we'll move on to step 2.
Yeah, that's right.
It's kind of perpetual through the conversations.
Yeah. That's interesting. Well, and I think that the sprint setup that we used in Change did help to perpetuate a sense of urgency, because the next deadline is always 2 weeks away. So that helped. For a program that was 2 to 3 years long.
Mm-hmm. Did you find there were some things that were too big to be done in a couple of weeks? How did you split those? Like, a software team would take an epic and they would break it down into small features, small user stories, and show a minimal progress. But for some of these big things, how did you approach dealing with those in sprints?
Well, I think it was a great discipline. I mean, because if you, let's say, target operating model, which is clearly something, a new target operating model, that was one of the things we needed to develop. Now, it's impossible to do that in 2 weeks, but having that discipline of having to produce something was really valuable. So it might be that it might be as simple as, first draft of, something we can talk about, 1 page sketched out, and forcing that iterative thinking was really useful in terms of productivity of the team, which takes me right back to the start in terms of just the overall win was effectiveness. And I think this program is going to be entered for an award and so on. So, it was a very successful program, and certainly much more effective than anything that they'd experienced before. But that's just one example of why it was effective, was because it forced this pace of getting something out there to talk around, that it was uncomfortable, but the client hadn't experienced before, and very different to this idea of we've got 6 months to produce something. But by having, we've got 2 weeks to produce an iteration, and every month we're going to be sharing something with the rest of the business, it just forced an energy that had a big difference, and served us well in the end, because midway through this program we took a big shifting course, but in order to maintain the trust of the people funding us, it was really important to show them that we'd done something. And because of the way that we're working, it wasn't like in the traditional waterfall sense, where you might get halfway through an analysis phase, let's say, and you really don't have anything much to show because everything's half-baked. In this case, we had early iterations of practically everything that we were due to create. So we had valuable, meaningful artifacts that had been discussed, and important conversations had been started around a number of areas that we could prove to our stakeholders that we'd done the work, and it allowed us to pivot much more effectively than had we been working in a more traditional way. Right. It's exactly the same way that software does, right? Exactly the same way that you have something of value that's in the hands of your users, it gives you that power to keep their trust as you continue to evolve, as opposed to another approach where you might not have anything shipped, that's valuable.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the challenges I see with some organizations is the fear of having something half baked to show. So there's a sense of either it's making me look incompetent that I can't finish this whole thing, or it's half baked, or it's not well thought through. That there's a sense of fear about not wanting to put out something that's not totally polished. So, but I do find that it's really that first hump, getting past that first hump. And people always ask me, I want to write a book, I want to do this, I want to do that. What's the first thing I should do? And I always say, publicly commit to something, because that's going to really create, especially if you get into analysis paralysis or you are a perfectionist, publicly commit. And I think doing those 2-week sprints, or demos or monthly showcases, again, use language, whatever makes sense. That is going to create that natural urgency to force us to think differently.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but there are two valuable, there are two valuable facets to that public show and tell. One is the fact you're having a public conversation, and then the second is, you're right, you're giving somebody something they know they've got to deliver for.
Yeah,
that's a very good point. And canvases were an important concept, actually, which came out at Lean Change Work, and this idea that one can create a canvas for anything, and that I think it also it complements nicely this idea of working in an iterative way, because in the traditional world we go through and you've got to create, let's say, as a target operating model as an artifact. We start with our Word document and we start with our table of contents, and maybe by the end of the first 2 weeks we've agreed what sections of our target operating model are, and we've signed off the template. That might be the traditional way of working, right? With working with the canvas, let's get the very first iteration of this thing out on one page with all of the big ideas we've got about the different aspects of, let's say, this operating model visualized. And that's the thing to deliver after 2 weeks. Now, that's a much more meaningful artifact to talk around and have a change conversation around than the table of contents of a big document that might come down the line in 6 months. So I found that is a really powerful way of working. And then, of course, it's fractal. You can keep delving down. So you might take one section of your high-level canvas and then make that a canvas in its own right, and so on. So that way of working, I think, was a really useful one.
Yeah. I've had someone who wrote a story on the blog, wrote about how they use the canvases, and said, really, after you go through it the first time, the data on it doesn't change that much. So people that have a fear of, well, if we're going to print this canvas out and we're going to put it up in the lunchrooms and use it as a communications tool, there's another artifact to maintain. But I find at a high level in the big ideas, they really don't change that much. There might be some small tweaks to language here and there, but still getting a rough cut done, getting it out there, getting some feedback from the people that have to live with the consequence, it's always better than the alternative. It just takes sometimes a leap of faith to try that approach first.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it does take a leap of faith, because and it feels so like, what, this is it?
Yeah.
And that idea that this is the 80, well, this probably is 80% of it. If we're on, right? We could write a 100-page Word document, we've probably got 80% of the meaning here. And I think what the course gave me was this sense of, again, it's a permission to create canvases, because so many different canvases are explored through the course. Just the central idea of whatever it is we need to communicate, we can communicate it on a single visual. And we ended up designing several different canvases at different stages of the program, partly inspired through the course, but mainly we just created, and also using pictures and making beautiful. I mean, that was what was great, is we had a visual artist on the team, and we'd do something which looked very engineering and very gritty, and then it'd come back with pictures and make it work really well.
This last piece reminds me of the movie Back to School with Rodney Dangerfield. So I guess dating myself a little bit, where he gets the professor or he gets the scientist who actually came up with the theory to write his paper for him, because he's a millionaire and he pays people to do all of his work for it. And he goes back to college and he gets this report printed out and he takes it and he goes, add a couple of pounds to it, gives it to the. So we tend to think things have to be heavier or we didn't do enough due diligence.
Right.
So as we get into the wrap up, tell people what is happening with you over the next few months.
Right. So in April, we've got another London course. So yeah, I'm partnering with consultancy Unboxed here in London, and we're going to put on another course, 20th, 21st of April. So really excited about that. I'm working the meetups in London, spreading the message, and I recently did a meetup for digital project managers here in London. I'm planning to do a few more over the coming months. I've got a gig to go and to present it at a client over here in the UK. So potentially to 60 or 70 of their practitioners, project managers, change managers, program managers, and so on within that organisation. And I'll continue to bring it to bear with my clients. I mean, I use this stuff all the time now. It's just how I operate. It's part of how I operate. And yeah, really looking forward to bringing it to different parts of the organisation, also different levels. So one of the things that may be coming up for me is more conversations with senior leadership teams about how to apply these principles. So I've had a lot of experience now with working with software delivery teams and delivery teams outside of software. I'm really excited now to be getting into that top level leadership conversation. How can we start applying these principles at the board level in terms of how senior leadership teams work and how they take these principles from there out into the organisation. So that's me at the moment. But yeah, I'm really excited to continue the journey with it.
Great. And people can find you on Twitter at Ratherton Rich, which I'll put right there in the for the video portion of it. So for those listening on the audio podcast, it'll be in the show notes as well. So if you want to reach out to Richard to hear some other stories, I'm sure he'd be happy to have a conversation.
Absolutely. And richardatherton.net is where I blog. And I'm part of firsthuman.com. We're a consulting group putting human first in a lot of consulting and coaching. So.
Excellent. Yes. Well, thanks very much for taking the time for the chat, and best of luck with the workshop, April 20th and 21st, you said?
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Great. Thanks very much for the chat. It's always a fun time.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you. Thanks to speak.